Welcome back. If you get frustrated by our election after only a week, spare a thought for the poor Americans who've been at it at least a year. The Trump phenomenon is one that has professional political pundits scratching their head. And what will it mean for our crucial alliance with the US? And Ambassador Cynthia Schneider is an expert in soft diplomacy and a co-director of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics at Georgetown University in Washington. She's visiting Australia currently as a guest of the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, and I caught up with her earlier. I have to start by addressing the elephant in the room, and by elephant I mean the Republican Party elephant, Donald Trump. We are quite obsessed like the rest of the world. I'd be interested in your take, particularly as you're a long-time Clinton supporter.
Right. Well, I'm glad you got that right out on the table. But I'll first begin by maybe trying to give some context for the support for Donald Trump, which I think is probably mystifying to many people here, as it is to me and others in the United States. But to understand it, you need to understand the incredible impact of the 2008 financial crisis. And what you are seeing with the support for Donald Trump is an expression of the anger, the frustration, and the sense of betrayal that comes with that. Why? Is because for many people it was economically devastating, and they haven't recovered, despite the fact that they keep hearing that the economy is recovering. They're not feeling it in their own personal lives. So it was economically devastating, but in addition to that, no one was held accountable. And the people who perpetrated it, the big banks, were bailed out and have gone basically scot-free. So people feel a tremendous sense of injustice and betrayal by the system. So they're looking for a champion completely outside the system. So in this election, experience is a bad word.
Hence why Hillary Clinton is having problems with Bernie Sanders as well.
That's why she's having problems with some young voters. And honestly, the youth has something to do with it also. I teach at university. My children are in their 20s, so I have a fair amount of connections with people in their 20s. And what you hear is that the things that Hillary Clinton is talking about, and of course the thing that's implicit, our first female president, how incredibly exciting is that, they will say, these young women in their 20s, well, I don't really see what's so important about the women's, so-called women's card. I haven't felt any discrimination in my life. I don't think it's such a big deal anymore. I think it's something for, older generations. Well, in my view, they haven't experienced anything yet. They're pretty young.
They're taking it for granted, aren't they? Because they didn't have to do the struggle to
get here. But people do get tired of hearing that. But I suspect that as their careers progress, they're going to encounter some challenges. They're going to overcome them, and more power to them. But their experience is still relatively limited. But having said that, Hillary Clinton has a huge foundation of support, and her foundation, her diverse foundation of support, is the reason why she is in a better position than Donald Trump, because she appeals across the board, all ages, all races, all different groups. She has a tremendous variety of support, and that's essential in the U.S. election because our electorate is diverse.
But I'm just wondering, though, yes, everyone assumed that with Donald Trump running against her, the threat would be over and she would beat him easily. But there were some polls this week in crucial swing states that show it's a lot closer than we think. And I noticed this week that Donald Trump is reaching out to Paul Ryan and the Republican establishment to get them behind him. In a two-horse race, is it always a threat, or are you quite confident that Hillary Clinton will win?
Well, first of all, Hillary Clinton would be the last person to say that she is quite confident. She's going to fight every day for this this election and feels, that's appropriate. That's what she should be doing. And if anything, it is, a completely unpredictable year. But Janine, if you'll forgive me, you're a journalist. You know that journalists always try to make the race look more interesting. So, of course, they're going to play up these polls. But let's remember, in contrast to your brilliant short election, and I would emphasize short, despite what you Australians are saying, ours goes on forever. And people aren't really going to concentrate on this until after Labor Day, the beginning of September. So honestly, I wouldn't really pay attention to any polls right now.
Okay, but let's talk about even before he wins, or before, not that he will win, but even before we get to the election. You talk a lot about soft diplomacy and the importance of that for America's standing in the world. What has, even thus far, the fact that the rest of the world is variously laughing at you, appalled by him, the UK Parliament even voted to ban him, doesn't this undermine America's power in a soft diplomacy way?
Well, I think it does. I think you're absolutely right, because the key characteristic of diplomacy of any sort in the 21st century is, taking into account the conditions for diplomacy today, 24/7 communication, citizen journalism, social media, the global connectedness. You can't control things anymore. You can't control things from a top-down model the way it was possible during, say, the Cold War period. So what that means is that countries, people, regions, you have to walk the walk. You can't just say, I stand for this. You're judged by your actions. So you're absolutely right. When the United States has a candidate who, says things that are racist, that are discriminatory, that are misogynistic, that has a significant negative impact on the United States image and the United States capacity to generate respect and admiration. Now, we'll see where this is going. I don't think it's permanent damage by any means, and I hope people will pay attention to the process. It's a very vigorous process where a lot of people participate, become engaged, work for their candidates. We'll talk about the issues that matter to the United States, and I hope the process will show people that we are indeed the country that we say we are.
The Australian-American Alliance, you're here with the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue. We often see view the alliance through the prism of hard diplomacy, military diplomacy, because that is a strategic alliance. But from a soft diplomacy point of view, how do you see the alliance in the context of this?
The alliance, the alliance itself is a classic example of the power and importance of soft power, soft diplomacy, where I would say also people-to-people diplomacy. Yes, we have military alliances, and they're very important. They're essential. But, let's face it, nobody wins wars anymore. So the United States or Australia is not going to win a position of prominence on the basis of military victories. They're essential, but they're not going to raise your status, particularly in the world. But behind those military relationships, these people-to-people relationships and exchanges that are established through the Australian-American leadership dialogue, they last, past all these conflicts, and you have people who have been coming together who get to know the other country through its people and gain a much deeper understanding and a much deeper sense of connection. Australia is pretty far away, but it is nonetheless in so many ways our closest allies, and these friendships that have been built up over the years in discussions around trade, around human rights, around the Asia-Pacific region, these discussions last no matter who is president or who is prime minister, and they form the basis for really the DNA of a close relationship.
You're a former art historian before you were an ambassador. You often talk about the importance of cultural diplomacy as well. Now, as you mentioned, we're having an election. There's a lot of concern that the arts in this country are being neglected. They're not being put in it. And certainly politicians are ignoring it a lot. They're just not seen as important. Yet from what you argue, cultural diplomacy is as important and the arts are as important as many other areas.
You know, I thank you for that question, Janine. I think countries are very, very preoccupied by how they are perceived in the world, and rightly so, because that is the source of their soft power. You know, soft power really means the power to influence, the power to persuade. And to have that power, you have to be admired. You have to be perceived as a model. It's not something you can force. So you have to have attributes that make people attracted to you, that make people admire you. Well, let's look at Australia. What are those? What shapes the image of Australia? I mean, sport is, of course, important. That's part of cultural diplomacy. But it's also the arts. You have fabulous visual artists, both, you know, white Australians, and certainly, I think, a greatly underutilized resource is your Aboriginal art and Aboriginal culture itself. I know that's a contested, challenging thing here, but my suggestion would be put those challenges out there. Expose them. Show how you're grappling with this very, very challenging history. And raise up these Aboriginal artistic voices. That's what you did in the Olympics. Look at how Australia presented itself in the Olympics. Didn't march out a whole lot of F-16s onto the field, you know, or a whole lot of businessmen in suits. You showed your culture. And that is how the world sees you. So when you then cut funding for the arts and make it more difficult for artists to make a living and to do their work, well, then you're cutting yourself off at the knees as a country. How are people going to know you? You know, I'll just, and there's so many wonderful assets to Australian culture. You have fantastic movies. You have a great sense of humor. I just watched on the plane this hilarious television show, The XPM. It is such a classic. It says so much about Australian society, including your very endearing modesty. You know, the idea that you would undercut your own artists, you know, it's hard to get to know Australia. You're far away. We're going to get to know you through what comes out of Australia. And what comes out is your artistic production. This is, of course, true also for the United States, and we live in a glass house in this regard. We, of course, have a very successful commercial culture, and that's very important and very influential. But we don't support our not-for-profit, our artists who, you know, are independent artists, are visual artists, and now there are all these bloggers, there are all these online artists, there's so many. We have really quite limited government support, and I think that's a tremendous mistake. You know, I'll quote what a great Dutch historian said about the United States, where he'd lived and a country he loved. He said, anyone who wants to know the United States should, of course, begin by reading Walt Whitman. Now, I think if you asked our government leaders, including those in charge of public diplomacy, I'm not sure they'd cite poetry as their greatest asset.
No, certainly not. And I'm going to leave it there, hoping that our politicians are watching as we head into some more arts funding cuts next week. Ambassador Schneider, thank you very much for your time. I hope the rest of your trip is successful.
Thank you so much, Janine. Thanks a lot.
Ambassador Cynthia Schneider. And that was just fortuitous. We were talking to her about the American election and Donald Trump. She's an expert, as she said, on soft diplomacy. She was here with the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, but that was a very impassioned argument for the importance of the cultural sector. Don't win wars anymore in the Olympics. Fascinating. You can read more about it. Very interesting lady on her website. Cynthia Schneider is her personal website. She does a fascinating group called Most, Muslims on Screen and Television, and another group called Timbuktu. You'll find lots of strings to her bow, but Very timely, her comments on that. We should pay attention. I'll be back with more in just a minute. Speaking of cultural issues, Eurovision.
Every young Australian needs a good start.
It's my first job and yeah, I love it.
I wake up with a smile each morning.
Mum was really happy when I got the job.
Over the moon.
To be a role model for my children.
Hopefully one day I can be a store manager.
I was like, my first paycheck.
I'll try hard for them because they gave me the opportunity. Every day.
Another Australian